Time?
8:57.
8:57. Okay, so I move to approve consent agenda items 7.02 through 7.07. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Okay, Ashley?
Mrs. Bendel?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoy?
Yes.
Mrs. Miller?
Yes.
Dr. Sabo? Yep. Dr. Schlepper?
Yes.
Okay, next up are our superintendent recommendations. Jennifer, you want to walk us through these?
Sure. So as Mr. Doherty discussed earlier, we will be doing some updates to policies just based on some Neola recommendations, whether it involved new laws that may have been put in place or some refinement of wording or some realignment of numbers. So if something looks rescinded, it's probably in a different number or a different place, which we've discussed. And unfortunately, 8.01 will require us to add the motion in the roll, because if you look down, it's not between 8.01 and 8.02.
Okay,
So I just need a motion.
okay, so I move to approve 8.01. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
And we need a roll.
Dr. Sabo?
Yes.
Dr. Schlepper?
Yes.
Mrs. Bendel?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoy?
Yes.
Mrs. Miller?
Yes.
And I'll take you through these fast unless you have questions. I'm just going to kind of give you an overview of what it says. So 8.02 is just certified personnel additional hours.
So moved. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Ashley?
Dr. Schlepper?
Yes.
Mrs. Bendel?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoy?
Yes.
Mrs. Miller?
Yes.
Dr. Sabo?
Yes.
8.03 is the additional 6-class stipend, which is in our contract for teachers that do that.
So moved. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Ashley?
Mrs. Bendel?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoy?
Yes.
Mrs. Miller?
Yes.
Dr. Sabo?
Yes.
Dr. Schlepper?
Yes.
8.04 would be classified personnel contracts.
Okay, so moved. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Ashley?
Mrs. Hoy?
Yes.
Mrs. Miller?
Yes.
Dr. Sabo?
Yes.
Dr. Schlepper?
Yes.
Mrs. Bendel?
Yes.
8.05 would be those classified personnel members that have additional hours.
Okay, so moved. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Mrs. Miller?
Yes.
Dr. Sabo?
Yes.
Dr. Schlepper?
Yes.
Mrs. Bendel?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoy?
Yes.
8.06 is a classified personnel resignation. I do just want to recognize Peggy. She's had service here and she's always a smile like Gurney when we're there after hours. So just want to congratulate her and she will be missed.
Okay, so moved. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Ashley?
Dr. Sabo?
Yes.
Dr. Schlepper?
Yes.
Mrs. Bendel?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoy?
Yes.
Mrs. Miller?
Yes.
8.07 is classified personnel and these would be supplemental payments.
So moved. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Dr. Schlepper?
Yes.
Mrs. Bendel?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoy?
Yes.
Mrs. Miller?
Yes.
Dr. Sabo?
Yes.
8.08 is supplemental contracts, payments for the district leadership team. This would be certified.
So moved. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Ashley?
Mrs. Bendel?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoy?
Yes.
Mrs. Miller?
Yes.
Dr. Sabo?
Yes.
Dr. Schlepper?
Yes.
I am going to add a note. I know I wasn't going to add that, but we had a wonderful music meeting today. So we've been meeting with the music department about their minutes and talking about 412. And I really appreciate from that came Cassidy being added to the district leadership team to bring in because we have to have more at the table when we're discussing these instructional minutes. And we promised a music audit, if you will, of time. And so just to let you know, those meetings are happening. We had a great one today.
That's so
Okay,
encouraging.
8.09, supplemental co-curricular contracts.
So moved. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Mrs. Hoy?
Yes.
Mrs. Miller?
Yes.
Dr. Sabo?
Yes.
Dr. Schlepper?
Yes.
Mrs. Bendel?
Yes.
8.10 is the resignation for an athletic supplemental co-curricular.
So moved. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Ashley?
Mrs. Miller?
Yes.
Dr. Sabo?
Yes.
Dr. Schlepper?
Yes.
Mrs. Bendel?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoy?
Yes.
8.11 would be athletic supplementals and co-curriculars as well.
So moved. Do I have a second?
A second.
I'll just mention this is the hiring of, the last one was resignations.
right.
Dr. Sabo?
Yes.
Dr. Schlepper?
Yes.
Mrs. Bendel?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoy?
Yes.
Mrs. Miller?
Yes.
8.12 is a resolution that needs to be approved.
So moved. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Ashley?
Dr. Schlepper?
Yes.
Mrs. Bendel?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoy?
Yes.
Mrs. Miller?
Yes.
Dr. Sabo?
Yes.
8.13 is another resolution agreement to be approved.
So moved. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Mrs. Bendel?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoy?
Yes.
Mrs. Miller?
Yes.
Dr. Sabo?
Yes.
Dr. Schlepper?
Yes.
8.14 is another type of resolution called an MOU, which is a memorandum of understanding. And this is for our SRO. We update that every so often, and so it's just time and no real changes, just the terms.
So moved. Do I have a second?
I will definitely second.
Ashley?
Mrs. Hoy?
Yes.
Mrs. Miller?
Yes.
Dr. Sabo?
Yes.
Dr. Schlepper?
Yes.
Mrs. Bendel?
Yes.
8.15 would be a PSI services change form. This would be for our RN services to cover a music field trip to New York City.
So moved. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Ashley?
Mrs. Miller?
Yes.
Dr. Sabo?
Yes.
Dr. Schlepper?
Yes.
Mrs. Bendel?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoy?
Yes.
8.16 is the Chagrin Falls Middle School trip to Washington DC. Maybe Mrs. DeSenza will dance again.
So moved. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Okay. Dr. Sabo?
Yes.
Dr. Schlepper?
Yes.
Mrs. Bendel?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoy?
Yes.
Mrs. Miller?
Yes.
8.17 is for the Learned Owl Bookshop Book Fair for CFMS.
So moved. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Dr. Schlepper?
Yes.
Mrs. Bendel?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoy?
Yes.
Mrs. Miller?
Yes.
Dr. Sabo?
Yes.
8.18 is the Community Ed Programming.
So moved. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Ashley?
Mrs. Bendel?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoy?
Yes.
Mrs. Miller?
Yes.
Dr. Sabo?
Yes.
Dr. Schlepper?
Yes.
8.19 is a student enrichment activity supplemental for CFHS Orchestra Club. It existed last year as well.
So moved. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Mrs. Hoy?
Yes.
Mrs. Miller?
Yes.
Dr. Sabo?
Yes.
Dr. Schlepper?
Yes.
Mrs. Bendel?
Yes.
8.20 is a proposal for the overnight extended student trip for the baseball team, high school baseball team.
So moved. Do I have a second?
Yes. I'll second.
Mrs. Miller?
Yes.
Dr. Sabo?
Yes.
Dr. Schlepper?
Yes.
Mrs. Bendel?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoy?
Yes.
And 8.21 is the agreement with Sodexo, which is basically changing the way that we're billed.
Okay. So moved. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Dr. Sabo?
Yes.
Dr. Schlepper?
Yes.
Mrs. Bendel?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoy?
Yes.
Mrs. Miller?
Yes.
So it wasn't just 8.01 that didn't have motions enrolled.
Yeah, I
wrote them all down.
That's what I was
Wait,
writing
I know, I
earlier.
was trying to give you some space, so I noticed that started at 8.13. We'll get that fixed.
Okay, we're on to treasurer's recommendations. Ashley, you want to take us through these?
Absolutely. Item 9.01 is equipment disposal. This is disposal of a tractor, landscape trailer. I'm recommending approval.
So moved. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Any other questions? Dr. Schlepper?
Yes.
Mrs. Bendel?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoy?
Yes.
Mrs. Miller?
Yes.
Dr. Sabo?
Yes.
Item 9.02 is the 5-year forecast. I'm going to go through all of these slides again.
No.
Oh, my gosh, my kids will be.
This is the actual report. This is what I presented earlier in the meeting, and this is what we need approval on. I'm recommending your approval.
So moved. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Mrs. Bendel?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoy?
Yes.
Mrs. Miller?
Yes.
Dr. Sabo?
Yes.
Dr. Schlepper?
Yes.
Okay. and then item 9.03 is October monthly reports. So after a motion and second, I will go through just a couple items, I promise. Need a motion?
So moved. I'll second.
Okay. So these are October. Because you're all so focused on finances, I'm gonna go ahead and go through them. First slide here is the general fund summary report. So this is only through October, this is through the end of October. Our ending cash balance right now is $25,801,275. This is the same format as our summary that we present on the 5-year. So if you're kind of looking at what we are expecting going forward as compared to what we're at right now, these rows here will correspond with slides that we were talking about earlier tonight. Every time. Every single time. Okay, this is a year-to-date comparison of our revenue. So you can see where revenue went down in 21, went back up in 22, and is slightly continuing to increase as compared to where we would have been all of these 5 years previous at the end of October. Okay, see, now I'm hitting the other button and it's going the other direction. Somebody is messing with me. Okay. This is still revenue. This is a month-to-month comparison. So you can see the individual months that add up to the amounts that gave us those year-to-date totals. October is, pretty consistent with what we've seen the past several years in October. This slide, and I'm going to keep pointing this out this year because it is a change from the previous few years. I have pulled out those other sources to kind of level it out and get those advances out of here because it kind of created havoc last year. And because those aren't really revenue and they're not really expenditures on the expenditure side. So those are pulled out of there. So this is just that first subtotal if you're actually looking at the 5-year forecast report. Okay. Moving to expenditures, this is the year to date for the end of October. Again, you can see, this follows pretty much the same trend that we would see on the annual basis. Expenditures are up from last year where we were in October. I think we are all expecting that at this point. Again, month to month on the expenditure side, you can see October's expenditures were up a little bit over last year, or the last few years in October. Cash fund balance, all of those gray lines are previous years, orange is this year, and then that cash balance will correspond to the first slide that we talked about tonight. This is the self-insurance fund report. We're hanging in there at about a $2.2 million balance, staying pretty flat, which is what we expect to see and what we're, what we want to see right now. So this is the report that shows all of the other funds. So most of the time I'm talking about only general fund. The last slide was self-insurance, and then this is all of the funds. So if there's anything in here that anybody is ever really curious about, I can provide more detail at any time. I just don't present it every month because it's not necessarily as much on everyone's radar as the general fund. Deposit investment, most of our money, as usual, is in Star, Ohio. Next largest portion there is the investment management account. That's the Red Tree account where we have almost $11 million. And then this is the item that I was talking about earlier when I was comparing to inflation. So this is just a snipped image directly from my software where these revenues and expenditures are taking into consideration all of our history that are in there, and then they're taking into consideration their estimates of inflation. And then there's a source right here, which I've linked, where they're getting their inflation number. So this is where that 5.6 number came from that I talked about earlier. And I just think it's really, it's a nice picture. I like the way, I like to look at this and see what a great job, we're doing as a district in really doing everything that we can to control our costs. And that was it. Very quiet tonight. Any questions on those?
You want to take the roll?
Okay, I will. Mrs. Hoy.
Yes.
Mrs. Miller.
Yes.
Dr. Sabo.
Yes.
Dr. Schlepper.
Yes.
Mrs. Bendel.
Yes. Okay,
Okay, me?
nobody's here, so I assume that
All
means no
No public.
public comment. Okay, our next meeting is December
10th, maybe?
11th.
11th. December 11th.
At the high school.
And it will be at the high school at 7 o'clock. And we are going to go into executive session.
Okay, I'd like to make a motion to enter into executive session in accordance with Ohio Revised Code 121.22 for the sole purpose of the consideration of the following matters: to consider one or more as applicable of the checkmarked items with respect to a public employee or official, employment, discipline, and compensation of a public employee or official. Can I have a second?
I'll second.
Mrs. Miller.
Yes.
Dr. Sabo.
Yes.
Dr. Schlepper.
Yes.
Mrs. Bendel.
Yes.
Mrs. Hoy.
Yes. Okay, we will not take
We will not
action
take
after this
action.
one,
Not
so.
So we're done. Would you like to go back to central office?
Yes.